Well, good morning. Hey, is there joy in the house of the Lord today? Huh? Hey, would you give, not just the worship team, but would you give God a round of applause for being so good? It's good to be back with you today. The last 2 weeks have been great for me to come home, be here next week, and as Ethan said, there'll be one service. And I think you probably already know this, but there are people who don't go to church on a regular basis who at Christmas and Easter, they're willing to go if someone will invite them. And so I want to encourage all of you to invite them. And I would love to have one of those problems here next week where we don't have enough seats and people are sitting on our shoulders. Let me rephrase that. People are sitting on your shoulders because I'm going to be up here. And so make sure you're inviting family, friends, just everyone. And I have no idea what Ethan is talking about with this being the 15th, that we have 10 more days if you're a last-minute shopper. This isn't even close to being last minute. I know what last minute is. I haven't even started yet. And so about the 23rd, that's when I'll start. And we've been looking at looking for peace this month. And we started 3 weeks ago now, looking at having peace with God. And we can't have peace if we're not at peace with God. That's where it begins. Then last week we looked at how we're to have peace with other people. And we talked about the importance of turning the other cheek and loving our enemies that really aren't our enemies. They're our mission field. And praying for those who hurt us. And we need to have peace with God, peace with other people. And today we're going to focus on having peace with ourselves, having that inner peace. Have you ever bought something from an advertisement, a commercial, or maybe an infomercial that looked so good, and then you found out it wasn't as good as you thought? Years ago, probably a couple of decades ago, they came out with this thing called the ab belt. And it was a thing that had electrical impulses that would exercise your abdominal muscles, and you didn't have to do sit-ups, crunches, walk, run. It exercised for you. What a great concept. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, I bought one, right? How many people think I bought one? Let me see your hands. You're wrong. You're wrong. I'm sharper than that. I got a deal where I got two for the price of one. I'm thinking, man, this is going to be great because I can lay on the couch, watch TV, eat Oreo cookies, and exercise all at the same time. And guess what? It didn't work. It isn't fair. It didn't work. Have you ever been treated poorly? Have you ever been talked about, maybe physically, mentally, emotionally hurt? It's not fair, is it? Well, if you haven't learned this by now, I need to share something with you this morning, and it's so important we're going to put it on the screen because I don't want you to miss this. Life isn't always fair. How many of you already knew that? Oh, we've experienced that, haven't we? There are times that something happens to us that we didn't want to happen, and then there are times that we want something to happen and it doesn't take place. And if we're not careful, we can become negative, perhaps cynical, angry, and bitter. And I want to encourage us today, if you're experiencing any of those emotions, any of those feelings, I want to encourage that this is the time to let it go. We're getting ready to enter into a new year. We're just a couple weeks away from 2025. And I don't want us to carry something into 2025 that happened in 2024, or maybe for some of us, it was months, years, decades ago, and we've been carrying it for a long time, and we need to let it go. So let's go back to that basic truth of life not being fair. How do we treat, how do we react that treatment when life isn't fair? Well, let me suggest a couple of common reactions. One is we play the blame game. The blame game approach. We blame other people and we get angry at other people. We keep score. We say things like, I don't get mad, I get even. And that seems to be just a mark of our culture. We can be like the whole story about a guy who got bit by a dog, and he went to the doctor, and they did some blood tests, and the doctor came back and he said, I got bad news. You got rabies. And the guy pulled out a pad of paper and he starts writing on it. And the doc said, wait, it's not fatal. You're not going to die. You don't have to make out your will. And the guy said, I'm not making out a will. I'm making a list of people I'm going to bite. And that's the way some of us respond It's our reaction. And if that's it, it leads to bitterness. I read a long time ago that it's been said that being bitter at someone is like drinking poison and thinking that we're hurting them. When we become bitter, it's like we're drinking poison. We think we're hurting them, but we're not hurting them at all. We're hurting ourselves. So we have this blame game. And it is impossible, please hear this, it is impossible to get better if you're bitter. We've got to let it go. Here's the second approach, and that is the retreat and hide approach. When we feel sorry for ourselves, we tend to withdraw. Have you ever heard the word WISP? W-I-S-P. It stands for wallowing in self-pity. And it's so easy to do that. Something happens or it doesn't happen, and we draw the shades, we lock the door, and we just wallow. And when we do that, it leads to bitterness. Life isn't always fair. So what are we going to do about it? How do we guard against being bitter? How do we get rid of it if it's already there? Well, I've chosen today to share a fairly heavy message with you because I believe that the last few years have been hard years for so many people. There's been disappointments, there's been discouragements, there's been hurts, and because of that, there's anger and bitterness that has taken root, or there's anxiety and depression that have been paralyzing. And my hope, my prayer is that today we will face those feelings. We will face what has happened or what hasn't happened, and then we'll say we're letting it go. We're letting it go. Whatever I carried in here today, I don't have to carry it out. I'm going to let it go. I'm going to defeat the darkness instead of having the darkness defeat me. So again, we're 2.5 weeks away from entering 2025, so let's spend some time looking at how we let it go. Ephesians 4:31 tells us, get rid of all bitterness, rage, anger, harsh words, and slander, as well as all types of evil behavior. The Apostle Paul says, get rid of all bitterness. The Bible never tells us to get rid of anything that is helpful, that is healthy. The Bible only says get rid of things that are hurtful, things that are not going to be helpful, things that are unhealthy. And the Bible tells us get rid of bitterness. In another verse from Hebrews 12, verse 15, we read, look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. Bitterness is like a root, and when it gets into our lives, it takes root and it starts to grow. And the bigger it gets, the more miserable we become. Bitterness causes problems, and I think we know that. I think everyone here would say, well, no, being bitter isn't good. We know that. And yet, so often, we struggle with bitterness. And when life isn't fair, we have to choose what view we're going to take. And let me suggest a couple of views. There's the world's view. And the world's view is life isn't fair, so I'm going to get even. So if someone hurts you or offends you, you get even. You look for ways that you can get them back. But here's the problem with that world's view. You may get even, but you don't get peace. The two don't go together. You may temporarily feel good because I got them back, but you won't have peace. 23 years ago, our family flew to Florida the day after Christmas. It was December 26, 2001. And if you remember 2001, just a few months before that was a thing called 9/11. And 9/11 impacted airports so that they had to have new security systems. And we flew out of St. Louis. It was all brand new. They said get there at least 2 hours early. We were there probably 2.5 to 3 hours early. And we stood in line. We went through security, and it took forever. And some of you are old enough to remember an O.J. Simpson commercial where he's running through the airport, hurdling over suitcases and dodging around people. That was our family of 5. Man, we're running through the airport, and we get to the gate, and I had the tickets in my hand, and I slapped them down, and I said, we made it. To which the lady looked at me and said, oh, I'm sorry, we've already closed the door. To which I tried to be helpful, and I said, well, just open it. And she let me know that once the door is closed, it can't be opened. And that more than likely they had given our seats to whoever was on standby. Now, I'd like to stand here in front of you and tell you, here's how I responded. I said, well, that's understandable. And if that's the worst thing that happens to us today, we're pretty blessed, aren't we? Now, could you help me figure out how do we get on the next flight? But I can't say that because somewhere in the Bible, I think it says, thou shalt not lie in church. It's not how I responded at all. I got mad. I slapped those tickets down again. I think I had a backpack, and I flung it over to a chair, and I didn't respond in a very good way. And I looked over, and my wife and my kids were embarrassed, and I knew that I had blown it. A few years later, I was flying home from being in Kenya and Congo for 2 weeks, and I had a layover in Atlanta, and Atlanta was experiencing one of those rare snowstorms. It was a blizzard that they weren't ready for, and they were canceling flights left and right, and so people were trying to get it figured out, what do we do? I'm in line trying to figure out what I was going to do, and I'm right behind a guy. He's at the counter, and he was yelling at the young lady who was working. He was using every cuss word I've ever heard, and I poured concrete. I've heard them all. And just ripping her, like it was her fault that there was a blizzard. It was embarrassing. And I'd like to say, well, I thought, buddy, you're not helping things here. You need to act a little bit better. But as I heard him, I had a flashback to several years before, and I thought, that was me. That was me. How embarrassing. So he walked away, and I stepped up to the counter, and the young lady was looking down. I think she was trying not to cry, and she said, can I help you? And I said, yes, you can. First, take a deep breath and know that guy was a jerk. And she looked up and smiled at me, and I said, but you were so good with him. How did you handle that? How did you keep from just blasting him back? And she said, we're trained, that we're trained how we have to respond to people like that. And I said, well, you did so good, but can I give you just a little advice on how you could do a little bit better next time? And I'm not sure she really wanted to hear it, but she said, sure. And I said, do exactly what you just did, and then check his bags to Bangkok. My friends, life isn't always fair. But when we respond from the human view that the results are bitter and cynical, and we become angry people. And that's our culture, that's our society, that's what we see all around us, but that's not who we've been called to be. We who follow Jesus are called to be different. And so we need to get rid of bitterness. So there's the world's point of view, and then there's God's point of view. 1 Peter 3:12 tells us, the eyes of the Lord watch over those who do right, and his ears are open to their prayers, but the Lord turns his face against those who do evil. Do you see what Peter's saying here? He's really saying God doesn't miss anything. He sees those who are doing good, and he sees those who are doing evil. And there's going to be a day that he's going to take care of those who are doing evil. And when we're at that point where life isn't fair and people have hurt us, it's easy for us to think, well, God, where are you? Why are you allowing this to happen? Aren't you watching? And we need to understand God doesn't work on a 40-hour week. God doesn't balance the books at the end of every month. But there will be a day when the righteous will be rewarded and the evil will be punished. So instead of becoming bitter and cynical and angry, we can say, okay, God, I'm letting go and I'm putting this in your hands. I trust you. I'll let you handle it instead of me. And I have to be honest with you, that's sounds a whole lot easier than it really is. It's not easy to do that. So how do we get to that point of being able to let go of being cynical, let go of being angry, let go of being bitter? Well, in the next few verses, Peter goes on to give 5 steps or principles that help. Let's quickly walk through those. The first one is focus on your blessings. In the first part of verse 14, he writes, but even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you for it. A mark of bitterness or a trait of bitterness is focusing on what is wrong instead of focusing on what is right. Focusing on the bad in people instead of the good in people. And when we do that, bitterness has a way of taking over. And again, Peter says, but even if you suffer for doing what is right, God will reward you. That's another way of saying life isn't fair, but you're still blessed. Even when life isn't fair, look for the good, because it's there. We all have blessings. We need to focus on them. One of my favorite stories from a long time ago was about parents that had identical twin boys, and they looked identical, but they were complete opposites when it came to their personality. One was the eternal optimist, and one was the eternal pessimist. And as they got a little bit older, they thought, well, maybe that's going to go away, but it just got worse. So they thought, well, something has to be done, because the one that's the optimist, he's going to get hurt at some point. Life isn't always easy, and he needs to be prepared for the hard part of life. And the one who's the pessimist, he's going to miss out on so many good things. And so they took their boys to a child psychologist. He listened to everything that was going on, and he said, well, here's what I want you to do. Christmas is coming up, and I want you to take the boys and put them in different rooms for their gifts. And the boy who is the pessimist, buy him the best toy that money can buy. And the little boy that's the eternal optimist, take a box and just fill it with horse manure. Put them in separate rooms. So they did that. Christmas morning, they got up and they look over, they open the door to see the little pessimistic boy, and there's this great big fire engine, red. It was so good. It had a ladder that cranked up, and he was cranking it up, and as he cranked it up, he said, that'll probably break. And he felt the bumper, and it wasn't a plastic bumper, it was a real metal bumper. And he touched it and said, that'll probably cut me. And he went around the whole truck and he found something bad about every part of the truck. They sneak over and they see the little optimistic boy, and his hands are shaking as he takes the ribbon off and he takes the lid off. His eyes light up and he reaches down and he starts throwing the manure up in there saying, I know there's a pony in here somewhere. I know there's a pony in here somewhere. My friends, as we get ready to enter 2025, here's my encouragement. Look for the pony. Look for the pony. Look for the good. Life isn't fair. It never has been. It never will be. But no matter what happens, you and I are blessed. No matter what happens, especially those of us who know Jesus, we are so blessed. And we need to focus on what we have, not what we don't have. Here's the second thing. Don't be afraid. The last part of verse 14 says, so don't worry or be afraid of their threats. When life isn't fair and hurts take place, we tend to not only focus on what happened, but we tend to focus on it may happen again. And because of what happened in the past, we start worrying about what might happen in the future. And that fear paralyzes us. It can become difficult to even function. And that fear robs us of our joy. And as joy decreases, bitterness increases. That's why this joy candle is so important. We have to have joy. One of the best ways to guard against bitterness is to be filled with joy. And here's the deal. Joy and bitterness don't coexist. You can't experience both. You've got to choose one. And I hope and pray that we will choose joy. Jesus tells us in John 14:1, don't let your hearts be troubled. Trust in God. Trust also in me. Over and over and over in the Bible, we read those words, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And the best way not to be afraid is to trust God. To trust that God sees you where you are. God sees what you're going through. God sees what is going on in your life. He sees what's not going on in your life. And we just hand everything over to Him. To get to that point where we can say, God, no matter what happens or doesn't happen, you and I can handle this together. And it's going to be mostly you, but I trust you. Which brings it to the next step, and that is turn it over to Jesus. The first part of verse 15 says, instead you must worship Christ as Lord of your life. You must worship Christ as Lord of your life. That more than likely isn't the first thing that we normally do when we get hurt or when life is disappointing or we start getting bitter. But I want to suggest that worshiping Jesus should always be our first response. Worshiping Jesus is what we run to, not what we run away from. And yet, all too often, when things happen in our lives, we tend to run away. And we run away from God. We run away from church. We run away from worship, and we need to be running toward it. Here's what I've seen over and over in my ministry, that so often we tend to hold on to the things that we need to let go of, and we let go of what we need to hold on to. Are you tracking with me? We hold on to the things that are unhealthy. We hold on to the things that cause us to be bitter. We need to let go of those, and we need to hold on to Jesus. There's an old story about how Henry Ford had a generator in his first auto plant that went down, so he called a man named Charlie Steinmetz to fix it. And Charlie came to the factory. He tinkered around for a couple of hours. He got it up and running. And a couple of days later, Henry Ford received a bill for $10,000. $10,000 back then was a whole lot of money. He returned the bill with a note that said, "Isn't this bill a little high for a few hours of tinkering around on these motors?" Steinmetz returned the bill to Ford, but this time it was itemized. It read, "For tinkering around on motors, $10. For knowing where to tinker, $9,990. Friends, listen to me. Jesus knows where to tinker. He knows everything going on in your life. He knows you better than you know yourself. And turn it over to Jesus. And if we hold on to Him, things are so much better. But if we walk away from Him, nothing's going to get better. All too often when life gets tough, we face various hurts and disappointments. We get angry, we get discouraged, and we run away from God. We run away from church. We run away from Jesus. We need to stop that. Our first response should always be to run toward Jesus. Worship is an antidote for worry. The more we worship, the less we worry. When I was a kid, I grew up in a little country church out here, South Fork, and we used to sing a hymn called "Does Jesus Care?" And I'm not going to make you suffer with me singing it to you, but let me read some of the words. "Does Jesus care when my heart is pained, too deeply for mirth or song, as the burdens press and the cares distress, and the way grows weary and long? Oh yes, He cares, I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary and the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares. Does Jesus care when I've said goodbye to the dearest on earth to me, and my sad heart aches till it nearly breaks? Is aught to Him does He see? Oh yes, He cares, I know He cares. His heart is touched with my grief. When the days are weary, the long nights dreary, I know my Savior cares." We need to turn it over to Jesus, who really does care. Here's the fourth step, and that is commit to be a witness. The next part of verse 15 says, "And if someone asks about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it." This passage is usually used to encourage people to share their faith with others, and that is a good reason for this verse, a good explanation for this verse. But let's consider two things that are important for us to really understand what Peter's saying here. First, it's written in the context of suffering. The people Peter was writing this letter to, life was not easy for them. They were being persecuted. They were suffering. And second, we're told that when people ask, we need to give the reason for our hope. It's a great opportunity. When bad things happen, that's when we can be a witness. Because it's easy, when life is so good and everything's going our way, to say, well, yeah, I have faith, I trust God. But when things go bad, that's when people pay attention. How are you still faithful? How are you still trusting God with everything that's going on in your life? People will ask, how do you do it? How do you handle this? What keeps you going? How can you still have joy? It's because of who we believe in, who we trust. When I was a senior in high school, toward the end of my senior year, we were playing baseball, and I got run into at second base. It broke my collarbone, and I was supposed to have surgery. And so I'm in the hospital, and a young nurse was there, and she was taking blood. And she was a baseball fan. I'm a baseball fan, and we're watching baseball up there, and she knows the players. We're having a great time, except for one thing. I hate needles. I am a wimp with needles, and so having 3 vials of blood drawn wasn't fun for me. But she finished up, and she gets ready to walk away, and then I heard those 2 words that you never want to hear from a medical professional, "Oh, no." And I thought, what's "oh, no" mean? And she said, "I'm supposed to put this blood in uncoated vials. I put them in coated vials." And again, being the helpful guy I am, I said, well, why don't you just pour them into the uncoated vials? And she let me know that can't happen, and so I put my arm out, and she took 3 more vials of blood. When she left, my roommate, who was a grown adult, said, "How'd you do that? I mean, I think I would have got mad. I would have yelled at her. Why didn't you get mad?" And I wish I could tell you that I was spiritually mature enough to say, well, I represent Christ, and I didn't want to be a bad example. But my real answer was, I hate needles, and the last thing I want to do was make the person who was about to stick me again mad. I did not want to do that. But this guy noticed that I didn't respond the way he might have responded. I think people notice. When life isn't fair, they notice how we respond. And if we can respond in a way that shows that we trust Jesus and that we have joy, not bitterness, they'll want to know more. Here's the last thing. Maintain your integrity. Verse 16 says, "But do this in a gentle and respectful way. Keep your conscience clear. Then if people speak against you, they will be ashamed when they see what a good life you live, because you belong to Christ." Are you seeing what we're told here? That's why we don't get even. That's why we turn the other cheek. That's why we don't say, I'm going to hurt you the way you hurt me. Nothing speaks louder than a life of integrity. And Paul says, keep a clear conscience. Don't compromise your faith. Don't blow it. Again, when life is going great, that's when it's not that difficult to do and say the right things. But when life is challenging, and when we're hurting, when life isn't fair, if we can keep our integrity, if we can keep our witness, that's when people notice. So life isn't always fair. And you know what? Bitterness never makes it better. Bitterness has this way of taking a bad day and turning it into a bad week. It takes a bad week and turns it into a bad month. It takes a bad month and turns it into a bad year. And if we're not careful, it takes a bad year and turns it into a miserable lifestyle. And here's the good news. We don't have to let that happen. God has a better plan. He wants us to get rid of all bitterness. And as we get ready to enter a new year, doesn't it seem like this would be a good time? A good time to draw the line and simply say, no more. No more. And whatever I carried in here, and whatever you carried in here today, again, you don't have to carry it out. And my guess is that some of you might be thinking, well, David, that all sounds good, but you don't know what I've been through. You don't know what my spouse did. You don't know about my parents. You don't know my boss. You don't understand how hard my life really is. And you're right, I don't. And please know, I don't want to sound callous. I don't want to sound cold. I don't want to sound condescending in any way, but I just have to put it this way. I don't, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what you're going through or what I'm going through, or if you're going through something that's harder than what I'm going through. It doesn't matter what we go through. Bitterness is never the right choice. Bitterness is something we have to get rid of so we can have joy. Bitterness is never the right answer. So in a few minutes, I'm going to pray. And if you have something you'd like to pray about, if you'd like someone to pray for you, we have a prayer room over here to my right, your left, and we would welcome you to go over there. There'll be people who'd love to pray with you and pray for you. But my guess is in a room with this many people, there are some of us here who have carried some stuff in that we don't need to carry out. And we're going to close our eyes, we're going to pray, and as we do that, I'm just going to encourage you. If there's something you need to let go of, something that you've been holding on to it, I'm just going to ask that you hold your hand out and just let it go. Just as Wade's saying, God, I surrender. I don't want to carry this any longer. I'm giving it up to you, and I'm trading in my bitterness for joy. Would you do that today? Let's pray. Father, I thank you for this day. I thank you for your word and for the way your word speaks to us. And God, I pray that you would be with those here who are hurting. God, there's all kinds of hurts. I pray that you would be with those people, God, who are dealing with bitterness, anger, negative thoughts, negative attitudes. God, I pray that you would help each one to just give that over to you. God, I thank you that you know everything about us. You know what we're going through, and it's not you who causes hurt to come into our lives, but you're the one who can give us peace. You're the one that gives us joy. So, Father, help us today to let go of the bitterness and to hold on to the joy that comes from Jesus. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.